Imagine this, a crisp autumn morning. The city is still half asleep, but you're already at the office, dressed in a perfectly pressed suit, tie in place, your schedule neatly organized. Your life runs like a well-oiled machine. From your job to your daily habits, the evening hangouts with friends, even the occasional dates, everything is in order. From the outside, you're the ideal image of stability, success, and self-mastery. People admire you. Some even envy you, but there's something they don't know. Deep inside, there's an emptiness that even you can't quite name. It feels like a locked room in the house of your soul, a room no one has ever entered. Sometimes, late at night when the city sleeps, you can feel that silence clearly. Not the silence of the world, but the silence within. You never admit it, not even to yourself, that there's something you've never truly touched. You've grown used to being in control, to living as if there were no hidden corners. Until that day, you weren't prepared. There was no dramatic scene. It was simply the presence of a woman, appearing in a fleeting moment, who somehow opened a door you thought had been locked forever. The remarkable thing was, she did nothing at all. No unexpected kiss, no sweet promises, no effort to impress. Just a passing glance, a quiet posture, a presence you couldn't explain. And it was that simplicity that began to shake everything inside you. You didn't understand why. Your mind wanted to dismiss it, to call it coincidence. But something deeper was stirring. A frequency both unfamiliar and strangely known, like a sound you once heard in a dream, now echoing in real life. From that moment on, you began to realize that your years of control had only been a mask. The world of emotions you had buried, the world you believed no longer existed, suddenly came alive. You felt yourself touched in a place no one had ever reached. In one sense, it felt like the relief of finding a spring in the desert. But in another, it was terrifying, because it was beyond your control. You had always been used to holding the wheel of your life. Now, in a single fleeting moment, you felt lost. For years, you've met people, fallen in love, laughed, and lived. But never once have you felt like this. It wasn't desire. It wasn't physical attraction. It wasn't a game of intellect. It was something quieter, like a gentle knock on the door of your soul, a door you had forgotten was even there. That night, back in your familiar apartment, you turned on the lights, poured yourself a glass of wine, and sat on the sofa like always. But something felt different. The quiet room seemed to carry an invisible presence. Her image drifted through your mind, not as a clear face, but as a feeling you couldn't name. You told yourself, it's just a passing moment. But the more you tried to push it away, the deeper it sank in. You realized that a part of you had been awakened, a part you thought never existed. People often believe a man is strongest when he is in control. But the truth is, real strength appears when he dares to face what he cannot control. And that's exactly what was happening. What that woman brought wasn't surface charm. It was an invisible mirror. In a brief moment, you saw yourself in it. Not the version you present to the world, but the real version, fragile and unseen. That night, you couldn't sleep. Every familiar image, every common word felt distant. All that remained was that feeling. A feeling both peaceful and unsettling, like standing in front of a secret door, wanting to open it, yet afraid of what lies behind. You didn't know it then, but that random moment had planted the seed of a journey no plan or schedule could ever arrange. A journey that would force you to look at yourself, not through success or social roles, but through the deepest part of all, your soul. Have you ever felt something like that? A passing moment, a look, a presence, and you realize from that second on, something inside you has changed. And there's no going back? If you have, you'll understand. This is not the beginning of an ordinary love story. This is the gentle touch of the soul. And once it touches you, it never leaves. He kept trying to convince himself it was just an illusion, that the feeling was nothing more than a fleeting moment from a long, tiring day, an unexplainable focus on a stranger's face. But in the days that followed, the more he thought about it, the more he realized that nothing about her was especially striking. Not her beauty, not her voice, not even a particular gesture. What haunted him had no clear shape. It was like an echo, a distant reverberation from somewhere deep within. Impossible to grasp, yet impossible to deny. People often say love begins with attraction, but for him, This was unlike any attraction he had ever known. This was not a story of captivating eyes or charming jokes. This was a story about an invisible frequency. Carl Jung once said the human soul does not fall in love with what is obvious, but with what is symbolic. And to him, she was a symbol, though he had no name for it yet. She stood before him like a strange mirror, not one that reflects appearance, but one that reveals layers he had never seen. In her silence, he heard echoes of himself. In her peace, he sensed the restlessness inside him stirring. It was hard to explain rationally, but her presence had exposed parts of him he had long buried. And the most confusing part was that she wasn't even trying. She made no effort to impress, sought no attention, carried none of the usual charm found in typical encounters between men and women. She simply was. And that simplicity became something unreachable. He began to realize that deep love doesn't come from what is obvious, from sweet words, thoughtful gifts, or deliberate touches. It comes from something more subtle, more invisible, a state, an energy, a presence. She was like a small flame, not one that blazed fiercely, but one bright enough to illuminate a dark room he had long kept locked. And that flame did not shine on her. It shone back on him. In many quiet moments, he asked himself, why does she affect me this much? The only answer he found was this: because she wasn't just a person in his eyes. She was a symbol, a mirror of everything he longed for but could never name. Maybe it was peace. Maybe it was freedom. Maybe it was the ability to simply exist without needing to prove anything. And all of that pulled him toward her like a magnetic force. He remembered his childhood, faint memories of a mother, a caregiver, female figures he once admired. It turned out there were still fragments within his soul, images stored deep in the collective unconscious. And now, she appeared as if all those shapes had gathered into one form. She wasn't a mother, nor a muse, nor a savior, but she carried an energy that encompassed them all. In that moment, he realized this wasn't just personal attraction. This was an encounter with an archetype, something beyond the limits of personality, something rooted in the soul's depths. And when a man reaches that depth, his mind will fight back in every way. Because how do you explain a nameless stirring? How do you hold on to something that can't be controlled? He began to feel afraid. He asked himself, am I just imagining things? Am I blowing a small moment out of proportion? But then, in moments of stillness, when the noise of the world faded, the feeling returned, not with her image, but with an invisible presence, like air slipping through every hidden corner of his being. The more he denied it, the more clearly it showed itself. He realized that love doesn't always begin with a choice. Sometimes it begins like a resonance, like two instruments accidentally playing on the same frequency. No one initiates it. No one plans it. But the sound is strong enough to reach the soul. And the strange part was, she did nothing. She simply existed. And that presence, in all its freedom and calm, became a silent language his unconscious instantly recognized. Even as his mind fought to reject it, he began to understand that he didn't love a person. He loved a symbol. Not her, but what she stirred within him. And that's why he couldn't walk away. If it were just a person, he could forget. But this was a mark, a mirror, a symbol carved into his mind. The more he resisted, the deeper it embedded itself. One night, he sat alone, opened a notebook he rarely used, and wrote a single sentence: I do not love her. I love what I see in myself when she is there. He paused, staring at the quiet words. And he knew, though he didn't want to admit it, that it was the truth. This love was not about her. It was about him. About the part of himself he had never known, never dared to face. Have you ever experienced something like that? When someone appears and without doing anything at all, they make you feel different? When you realize that the feeling you call love is really a resonance with a part of yourself that had been asleep? If you have, then you understand. The deepest kind of love is not love for another person. It is love for the part of your soul that awakens within you through their reflection. And once that awakening happens, your life will never be the same again. He was never the type to be easily shaken. For years, he had learned how to manage his emotions, to turn everything into clean, straight lines and plans he could control. But since that day, something had slipped out of his hands. He felt like a man who tightly held a map yet stood in a land he had never set foot on. His mind, once a stronghold of reason, began to build even more walls to protect itself. He tried to brush it off, tried to bury it, tried to act as if nothing had happened. He returned to his usual rhythm work, meetings, noisy nights out with friends. But somewhere beneath the surface, there was another beat, soft yet persistent, reminding him that something had touched him. He kept telling himself, "It's just an illusion. It's nothing. I'm exaggerating." But the more he repeated those words, the more they felt false. Because sometimes all it took was an unexpected pause, and her image would return, not her exact face, but an echo, a presence. He didn't understand why something so small could hold such power. And it was this not knowing that made him feel lost. A man who had always been in control now couldn't even control a feeling. When a man is touched to his core, his first instinct is rarely to open up. It's to retreat. He reached for rational excuses. "I'm just busy. She's not important. This will pass." He did everything to separate himself from the emotion. But the truth was, the more he stepped back, the more those walls revealed his fear. He wasn't afraid of her. He was afraid of himself. Afraid to face the part of him that was vulnerable, uncontrolled, and buried for so long. The irony was, in those moments of pulling away, he felt more clearly that what had happened was anything but small. He was torn. On the outside, he seemed calm and composed, but inside there was a quiet rebellion. His mind wanted to move on, but his heart was resisting in silence. At times, he asked himself, "Am I being too weak? How could someone like me be shaken by just a presence?" But he slowly realized it wasn't about what she had done. It was about what she made him face, a part of himself he had never dared to look at. At night, when the city noise faded, when the laughter, work calls, and phone notifications all went silent, that was when he could hear the echo most clearly. In the darkness, with no masks left to wear, he felt it plainly he had been touched, and nothing could bring back the total control he once had. Have you ever felt something like that? When someone touches a deep part of you, and all you can do is retreat, thinking that distance will keep you safe? Have you ever built walls of logic while trembling inside from a nameless emotion? If you have, then you understand him right now. The fascinating truth is, that moment of defense often reveals something important. The masculine soul does not open through logic, but through being forced to face emptiness, vulnerability, and the deep desire for connection. And that woman, by not trying at all, became the symbol of all of it. He began to see that his reaction wasn't because she was extraordinary, but because she had unknowingly awakened things he had hidden. Every time he tried to deny it, he understood more clearly that he was fighting himself. And then, in the middle of that struggle, a quiet question rose. How much longer can I keep running? Maybe you felt that too. Someone stirred you so deeply you had to step back, even though you didn't want to admit it. If this reminds you of something within yourself, feel free to share your story in the comments. Maybe your experience will be the light someone else needs while they wrestle with their own tangled emotions. And if this reflection touches you, tap like, share it so others may find resonance too. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more journeys into the inner self, because sometimes all it takes is one moment when we decide to stop running. Then we realize that fear is not the enemy. It's the doorway back to ourselves, and that door, sooner or later, needs to be opened. He once believed his darkness was something he could hide forever, like a locked cellar with no key. But then he realized that some doors are not opened by force, but by the lightest of touches. And she, with her quiet presence, opened that door. From that moment on, he was forced to face a part of himself he had never dared to enter. Beneath all the armor he wore, strength, success, confidence existed another world. A world of fragility, of unspoken desires, of fears he had long suppressed. In that world, he was still the child who feared abandonment, who longed to be held, who wished to show weakness without being judged. He had buried all of that for years, learning to replace it with control, with achievement, with a serious face. But in her presence, what he had hidden began to rise to the surface. He didn't understand why he felt both drawn in and terrified. He wanted to be close, but also to run far away. Because every time he stood before her, he no longer felt like the invincible man he had built himself to be. He became fragile, exposed, easily seen through. And that was both captivating and terrifying. People fear what they don't know. But the most terrifying thing of all is being forced to look into yourself. That was when he realized that the shadow wasn't just a concept in books, but a living reality. His shadow was everything he had denied: the fear of rejection, the longing to be loved without proving his worth, the softness he once labeled as failure. And now, all of it was rushing in at once. At first, he tried to run. He buried himself in work, surrounded himself with noise, with fleeting encounters. He thought if he stayed busy enough, if there was enough distraction, the inner echoes would fade. But the irony was, those rare quiet moments only made them louder. At night, when there was no one left to talk to, nothing to distract him, the feeling returned. Not her face, not her voice, but the emotion her presence once awakened. A feeling like standing in front of an unrelenting mirror, one that forced him to look at everything he had been avoiding his whole life. The shadow never disappears when you run from it. It only grows stronger, denser, until you finally face it. And he began to understand that her presence was never meant to bring romance, but to offer him the key to his inner cellar. It felt like both an invitation and a threat, because to step through that door, he had to accept that he wasn't perfect, that he was vulnerable too, that he longed to be loved in the most honest way. He remembered one night, in the middle of another sleepless stretch, sitting alone in front of the mirror. The dim light cast soft shadows on his tired face, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to cry, not because of her, but because of himself. Because for so long, he had tried to become someone else. He had lived as if weakness was the enemy, as if strength meant always holding it together. And now, in that mirror, he saw it clearly: his weakness was the part he needed to learn to love most. She wasn't there, but her presence lingered, like a soundtrack that never stopped playing. And the strange thing was, he didn't need her to actually be by his side. Just the memory of her peace was enough to guide him inward, on a journey that wasn't easy, but absolutely necessary. Men are often taught they must be strong, in control, unshakable in every moment. But in the dark, he discovered that true strength doesn't come from control. It comes from letting go, from accepting that there are parts of you that are not perfect, and still, they are worthy of love. The shadow is not the enemy. It is a part of the soul waiting to be seen. And if he had the courage to look, it would no longer be a threat, but a source of power. That night, he closed his eyes and whispered, "Maybe I'm not afraid of her. Maybe I'm afraid of myself." The words echoed in the still room, sounding both like a confession and a first step. He knew the journey ahead would be long, but at least he had stopped running. And that was the most important beginning of all. Have you ever experienced a moment like that? When someone, whether they meant to or not, forced you to see the deepest, darkest part of yourself? Have you ever felt the fear of realizing that beneath all your strength lies a soft heart, aching to be held? If you have, then you understand. This is not the end. This is the beginning of the most important encounter of all, the one with your own shadow. He used to believe that burying it would make it disappear. That time would blur what had happened. But the truth was the opposite. The more he tried to forget, the clearer the feeling became. It was like a scent clinging to his clothes. The more he washed, the deeper it stayed. And he began to understand that what he was wrestling with was no longer just the memory of her, but a deep imprint on his soul. At first, he tried to replace it. He met other women, stepped into fleeting relationships, chased new attention. He told himself, "All I need is someone else, and that feeling will vanish." But it only got worse. Every time he looked into a new face, a silent comparison echoed inside him. No one was like her. No one could recreate that feeling. No one brought him the calm light she had once given so effortlessly. And slowly, he realized he wasn't truly looking for a person. He was chasing a feeling. The painful truth was, that feeling could not be replaced, because it didn't come from her as an individual. It came from the reflection she stirred within him. He had been confused, thinking he longed for her. But in truth, what he longed for was the part of himself that awakened in her presence. A part he had never known, yet now couldn't ignore. And it was this confusion that turned into obsession. He began to feel trapped in a strange loop. During the day, he acted as if nothing had changed. He worked, attended social gatherings, kept up appearances. But at night, when the world grew quiet and the room was still, the feeling would rise again. Like a ghost, it refused to fade. He thought he had moved on, but in truth, his unconscious mind was at work. It wouldn't let him erase that mark. On the contrary, it carved it deeper, as if to remind him this wasn't a passing experience. This was a threshold. Carl Jung once said, "What we deny within ourselves becomes our destiny." And he was living proof of that. The more he denied it, the more he repeated to himself, nothing happened, the more the truth clung to him. He saw glimpses of her in strangers on the street. A melody playing by chance would bring back the quiet peace she once carried. Sometimes, even a ray of light falling through the window could make his chest tighten, because it reminded him of that brief afternoon when she sat silently and unknowingly touched a place so deep inside him. He knew he couldn't keep running forever, but he also didn't know what to do with everything that was unraveling inside. His heart was pulled in two directions, one side yearning to return, to feel that presence once more, the other afraid of what would surface if he dared to take one more step. So he chose the easier path, keeping distance, pretending to forget. But deep down, the obsession kept growing. Some nights, he would wake up not from nightmares, but from dreams that felt too real. In those dreams, she never said a word. She only looked at him. And that look would jolt him awake, heart racing. Sitting in the dark, he would ask himself, what am I really losing? A woman or a part of myself? That question returned again and again, refusing to let go. And then he realized a painful truth. The ache he carried was not about losing a person. It was deeper than that. It was the ache of losing a chance to heal, to truly connect, to face and reconcile with the darkness inside himself. She was never just a fleeting love. She was a door, and by retreating, he had closed it with his own hands. He felt the emptiness inside him grow wider, deeper, not because she was gone, but because he had missed the chance to cross that threshold. And now, all that remained was the haunting. He found himself living with a song that never ended, a song that played whenever he was alone, whenever he was honest with himself. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was relentless, impossible to silence. That haunting didn't let him rest, but slowly, it began to plant a seed of awareness. Because deep down, he knew he could no longer live the way he used to. He could no longer wear the mask, no longer pretend to be strong all the time. Because if he did, he would live a hollow life, always missing something he couldn't name. Maybe you felt something like this too. When someone leaves and you think the pain is about losing them, but over time, you begin to understand that what you truly lost was the version of yourself you once saw in their presence. And you start to live in a spiral of searching, comparing, longing, but never really finding it again. If you've been there, then you understand him now. He sat in the stillness of his room and exhaled. The pain was no longer a sharp cut, but a steady wave, sometimes soft, sometimes crashing, but always there. And he understood there was no choice left but to face it, because this loss was not meant to destroy him. It was meant to take him somewhere deeper, somewhere he had never dared to go. And that path, sooner or later, he would have to walk. As time passed, he continued to live in two parallel worlds. One on the outside, where he played the familiar role, successful, strong, composed. And one on the inside, where the obsession kept whispering, where the shadows never stopped shifting. The tension between these two worlds grew heavier, until one day, he understood that he couldn't go on like this. He couldn't keep wearing a mask while longing for truth. He couldn't keep running and still hope to be free. The turning point didn't come from a dramatic event or a major breakdown. It came in a completely ordinary moment. One late afternoon, after a long day, he returned home, hung his coat on the chair, and sat down in silence. No one was there, no laughter, no sound, and in that stillness, he heard himself. A question echoed, as if someone had whispered it right into his ear. How long have I been running? He sat there in silence, without an answer. But his body trembled, as if something had been exposed. That was the moment he realized this pain could not be healed by seeking outward. No one else could fill the void. He had to turn inward. He had to begin the journey he had feared the most, the journey of facing himself. From that moment on, a subtle shift began. He no longer tried to avoid her image when it returned in his mind. Instead of pushing it away, he allowed himself to look. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and let the memories rise. But this time, he didn't ask, why did she leave? He asked, what part of me was awakened when she was here? That question opened a new door. He realized her presence was never a promise of a relationship. It was a mirror, and in that mirror, he saw himself fragile, tender, yearning to be loved, without needing to prove anything. And instead of seeing that as a failure, for the first time, he saw it as an invitation to be more real, more human, more himself. He began writing in a journal, something he had once thought pointless. Each page became a space for honesty. He wrote about fear, about hiding, about the chances he had let slip away. He wrote about the feeling she had brought, not to cling to it, but to understand it, because the more he wrote, the clearer it became. What he had truly been searching for was not her, but the part of his soul he had seen reflected through her. At first, the process was difficult. Some days he stared at the blank page for hours, not knowing where to start. Sometimes painful memories flooded in all at once, and he wanted to shut the notebook, to throw it away. But slowly, he learned patience. He learned to let the darkness speak, instead of locking it away. He came to understand that only when both light and shadow are acknowledged can a person become whole. At the same time, he realized how long he had been living fragmented. He used to think strength was about control. But now, he saw that true strength lies in the ability to hold uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, he began to learn how to trust himself, not the perfect version, but the one full of cracks, yet real. There were evenings when he would sit in the dark, simply listening to his own breath. At first, that silence was frightening, but over time, it became a companion. He no longer felt alone, because for the first time, he was truly with himself. And in those moments, he felt a strange peace, as if the storm within him was beginning to quiet. He also began paying attention to how he lived each day. Instead of chasing validation from others, he focused on listening to himself. When he was tired, he let himself rest. When he was sad, he let himself cry. When he was joyful, he no longer needed to prove it to anyone. He realized that most of his pain didn't come from others. It came from not being honest with himself. Little by little, he stopped hoping she would return, because he knew if she did, he might cling to her like a lifeline again. But what he needed wasn't a lifeline. What he needed was to learn how to stand in the deep waters of his own soul. She had only opened the door. The journey beyond it was his to walk. He looked back at everything that had happened and understood this loss was not an ending, but a beginning that required courage, patience, and radical honesty. And he knew these were only the first steps, but at least this time, he wasn't running anymore. Have you ever come to a moment like that in your own life? When you realized no one else could save you but yourself? When you understood that the love you were searching for wasn't in another person, but in the part of your soul reflected through them? If you have, then you understand him. Because that is when the true inner journey begins. He once believed that love was a journey where two people held hands to fill each other's emptiness, that someone would come along and complete the parts he was missing. But in the end, he realized that love like that is only an exchange between two fears, between two voids. It's like two people trying to use each other's presence to fill what's empty inside. But that emptiness never truly disappears. The more you cling, the wider it grows. Now, after countless nights of inner turmoil and tear-stained journal pages, he began to see love through a different lens. He no longer wished for her to return so she could complete him. He no longer believed that her presence would make everything okay. He understood now that her role was never to fill the gaps, but to awaken what had long been asleep. And through her leaving, he was forced to turn and face himself. He came to realize that love is not dependence, nor is it a race to win or a battle to hold on. It's not a power struggle where one wins and the other loses. True love is presence. It is the ability to stand fully in your own being, and from that place, create space for the other to be fully themselves. No proving, no pretending, no control. He began learning to love himself that way. When he looked in the mirror, he no longer saw a man who had to always be strong, successful, in control. He saw a human being, full of both light and shadow. And in accepting that truth, he felt freer than ever. Because love, at its core, begins with the ability to sit with yourself without feeling empty. This shift in understanding made him reflect on past relationships. He realized most of them were built on fear. The fear of being abandoned, of not being enough, of not being loved. And when both people love from fear, love turns into control. One demands, the other retreats. One clings, the other escapes. That thing called love becomes nothing more than an exchange between two unhealed shadows. But this time, he wanted something different. He didn't want to love from lack anymore. He wanted to love from wholeness. Not because he needed someone to fill a void, but because he had so much to share. Not because he feared loneliness, but because he had learned how to be at peace with it. And when love comes from that place of wholeness, it becomes a gift, not a negotiation. He still thought of her, but now the feeling no longer hurt. He no longer longed for her return, no longer silently blamed her for leaving. He knew that if she were to return now, he would no longer look at her through the same eyes. Because now, he understood that love is not about possession. It's about gratitude for what was awakened in you through someone else's presence. In the silence, he smiled. Maybe she never knew that her brief presence had created such a profound shift in his life. But he didn't need her to know. He understood that the greatest truth does not lie in being reciprocated, but in the transformation that takes place within. Love, after all, is about becoming. He began to envision a new kind of love. A love where two people don't come together out of fear of missing something, but because they have found themselves. A love where no one needs to act to be worthy, where no one has to perform to be loved, where each arrives as their own flame, already burning bright, and when they meet, their light expands, not because they depend on each other, but because they are free. And he knew that is the kind of love he was now searching for. Not a love that disorients him, not a love that turns him into someone who clings, but a love where both grow, where both face their shadows, and walk together toward the light. He sat down and wrote a single line in his journal. Love is not about finding a half to make you whole. Love is about finding a soul already whole, so you can share your fullness together. That line glowed in his heart, like a new promise. Maybe he hadn't found that kind of love yet. Maybe the road ahead was still long and lonely. But what mattered most was that he now knew what he was looking for. Not a person, but a way of loving. Not a replacement, but a truth. And it was that truth that had set him free. Have you ever had a moment when love was redefined within you? When you realized that all the heartbreak, the loss, the haunting, were only meant to lead you somewhere new, to a place where love is no longer lack, but presence? If you have, then you understand him now, not someone seeking rescue from the outside, but someone who has learned to become his own source of light. Time had passed long enough for the initial wounds to stop bleeding, but not long enough for them to fully disappear. Still, what mattered most to him now wasn't forgetting, but transformation. Because he had come to understand this. There are memories that don't need to be erased, only held, like a lantern lighting the path. And she, the woman who once appeared and quietly left, had become an enduring symbol in his journey. When he thought of her now, there was no longer the ache or turmoil that once overwhelmed him. Instead, he felt a quiet gratitude, grateful that she hadn't tried to stay, grateful that she had chosen to leave at just the right time so he would be forced to turn inward. If she had stayed, he might have kept clinging, kept avoiding his own shadow. But it was her departure that opened the door, that made him face himself, that pushed him to grow. He understood now that sometimes a person's role in your life isn't to walk beside you, but to wake you up. They come, they touch something, they leave, and in the space they leave behind, you find yourself. True love, he realized, doesn't always live in longevity, but in resonance. Like a melody, just once is enough for it to echo through a lifetime. He began to see life through different eyes. The things he used to consider important control, perfection, the roles society expected, had become just surface noise. What mattered more now was inner truth, the ability to sit in silence with himself and feel at peace, the freedom of no longer having to pretend to be strong, the quiet joy of living as he truly was, even if he was still messy, still full of contradictions. She was still with him, but no longer as a flesh and blood woman. She had become a symbol of freedom, of presence, of the power to touch another soul simply by being. And that symbol he now carried in his heart like a compass. He no longer searched for her in other faces, no longer hoped someone else would replace her. He understood now that what he truly needed had always been within him, just waiting to be awakened. He remembered a quote by Jung: "The great encounters in life are not by chance. They are necessary so that the soul can evolve." And he smiled. Because now, that quote wasn't just philosophy, it was a living truth. That brief encounter with her had become a turning point, a small moment that opened the way for a whole new journey. He knew that along the road ahead, there would still be moments of stumbling, still fears and doubts that returned. But the difference now was that he no longer ran from them. He had learned to face them, to welcome both light and shadow. And in that acceptance, he felt more whole, more human, more alive. He no longer needed love to prove his worth. He no longer needed a woman to fill the emptiness. If love came, he would receive it in freedom. If not, he would still be full, because he had learned how to love himself. And that was the greatest gift the encounter had left him with. One still afternoon, he sat on the balcony, watching the last light of day spill across the rooftops. No memory made him flinch anymore. Instead, there was a deep, steady peace. He knew he had completed a full circle from control to loss, from obsession to surrender, from shadow to light. And it was that circle that had brought him back to the center of himself. Have you ever met someone like that? Someone who didn't stay but left a mark that never faded? Someone who made you realize that what you were searching for was never outside but always within? If you have, then you understand they never truly leave. They only change form, from a person into a symbol, from a presence into a vivid memory in your soul. To him, she was no longer pain. She was the key that opened the door to his true self. And when he remembered her now, he no longer longed to possess her. He simply felt grateful, because love, after all, is not about holding on. It is about being transformed. Today, as he walked through the noise of the city, he no longer felt lost. He knew he was carrying something precious, not her image, but the freedom that had been awakened by that meeting. And he understood that even though she was no longer here, the love was still alive, not as a relationship, but as a symbol, a quiet flame lighting the way forward. And in that silence, he smiled. Because after everything, he had come to see some people don't come to stay. They come to remind us that our soul can still feel, still love, still become whole. And that, he realized, is the deepest kind of love. He once thought love was a place to seek shelter, to lean on, to fill what was missing. But in the end, he understood true love is not where we find someone else. It's where we find ourselves, through them. She had left, but the echo remained like a soft trail of light across the night sky. No longer bright, but just enough to remind him that once, that light had existed. And maybe it is from the ones who simply pass through our lives that we learn the deepest truth of all, that love is not for holding, but for awakening. Have you ever wondered, maybe the people who haunt us most are not the ones who stayed, but the souls sent to awaken us, only to disappear? And if that's true, then their departure is not the end. It's only a pause, one that opens a whole new chapter we never thought we had the courage to write. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this story. If this message touched your heart, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss the next journey we take together. Your support means the world to me.